In Essential Task 3.4, we are going to be talking what's called attribution theory. That might not be a term that you've seen before, so we will define that here at the top. I reference the letter H for a horizontal concept map on the text of the goal. I think with the definition of attribution at the top and then 5 columns across, a horizontal concept map would make the most sense. That'll give you an opportunity to pause here before continuing onward and actually defining the term attribution. When we use the word attribution or we apply the various theories regarding attribution, what we're talking about is a discussion of trying to determine how people judge and what influences the judgment for the causes of others' behavior. And what I mean by that is, if somebody cuts you off, kind of like this image here indicates, and you sit there in your car and you think to yourself, what is causing the behavior of that other person? What is causing that person to drive recklessly? You could, in the moment, consider and say, this is just a horrible person. They're a terrible driver. They're a bad person, reckless, etc. Or alternatively, you could think to yourself, well, maybe that person is in a rush. Regardless of what end of the spectrum you fall on, whether you target their personality or you consider the circumstances, in that moment you're applying what's called attribution. You're trying to determine, in your opinion, what is causing others to behave the way they behave. And you can apply this to your coworkers, to your family members, to your teachers, really to just about anyone. Why do people act the way they do? That's what the question is regarding attribution. There are 5 columns across, 5 specific terms related to this process. We'll start all the way on the left with fundamental attribution error. Now, we were in class, we would start with this demo where I would ask you to anonymously evaluate what you think causes your teachers to act the way they do. And typically when we do this, I get a variety of responses, and we do this in a really anonymous way where you're not telling me the names of your teachers, you're not telling me the gender, you're not telling me what grade you had them in. And the reason for doing that is the way your teachers act in school, at work, might not necessarily match how they act in other circumstances. Like, for example, this is what it looked like when the Bruins won the Stanley Cup. That is, in fact, me in the middle. That was quite a few years ago, so about 10 years ago now, but that's a different circumstance, a different setting. You notice the way I'm acting. I run the game club here at Apponequet. This is what it would look like when I was at a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament in Seattle, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Also a very different situation. And the reason I'm showing you these pictures of myself is that the first concept, called fundamental attribution error, very much relates to those 2 images. When we look at another person, whether it's a teacher, a family member, or a coworker, or just a stranger, we have the tendency to underestimate how much the situation that they are in is influencing their behavior, what we call external factors, and overestimate the impact of their personality. So, for example, you might have this perception of a teacher, and your perception of that teacher might be that they're cool, calm, collected, whatever it might be, without stepping back and saying, maybe my perception of this teacher is distorted a little bit because the only situation that I experience an interaction with this teacher in is at school. And maybe the setting of school in and of itself is an external factor that I'm not really considering. And I imagine many of you can relate to this. I bet the way you act and the way you come across at work is very different than at school in the classroom versus very, very different at home around your family and friends. You can probably very much relate to the fact that how you behave is very much impacted by the situation. So when we look at the fundamental attribution error, we tend not to apply that same standard to other people. So if you see somebody at work and you think to yourself, this person is really abrasive and harsh, that's just their personality. They're a mean person. You might not realize that the situation, the really stressful work environment, that situational external factor might actually have an impact on their behavior. We tend to overestimate personality or internal factors and underestimate external factors like the situation. So you might have whatever perception of me that you have about what influences my personality, but that personality evaluation might be impacted by the fact that you only see me at school. How I act in other situations might be very different, as you can clearly see from that image not too long ago. When the Bruins win the Stanley Cup, it's a very different behavioral pattern. That might not match your perception of me at school. So without getting sort of into spoilers or details, this is a picture of Darth Vader, sort of the obligatory villain of a movie series. And if I were to ask you, why does Darth Vader or just any villain act the way they do, people would tend to do this. You don't have to copy all of this down. This is just an example. I'm going to give a lot of little blurbs here. But we tend to look at a movie, watch the villain, and say, that movie or that villain is mean, cruel, no heart, horrible person. They're diabolical, malicious. We tend to identify personality traits and hammer them for it. And without getting into too much specifics, if you're familiar with the story of Darth Vader and sort of his early days, there are definitely some life events in his life that may or less have contributed to sort of the image that he presents as Darth Vader in that movie series. There are definitely some life situational factors that might be able to explain his personality. But typically when we watch a movie or we just evaluate anyone, we tend to highlight personality and not stop and think about situation. So if you go back to the example of being cut off while driving, we tend to think horrible driver, reckless person. But do you stop and think, well, maybe that person is in a rush because they're late to work or they're in the middle of an emergency and they're trying to get to the hospital. We tend not to consider the situation as much for them. And if you can even think to yourself, how often does your driving change when you're late? So you can relate it to yourself, but you have a tough time relating it to other people because we tend to overestimate the left, blame personality, and underestimate situation. And then the opposite is kind of true for us. What's called the self-serving bias is our tendency to attribute our success on our own efforts, but then blame something situational for our failures. So what I mean by that is, if you do really well in school, you might say, well, it's because I studied, or I do a lot of work, or I really care. But the second you have a poor grade, all of a sudden you flip it and say, that teacher failed to prepare us. That test was unfair. The room was too dark. The room was too loud. It was too early in the morning. You start to consider situational external factors the second you have to evaluate your own behavioral patterns. So when you do really well, it's, I'm smart, I studied, I am so talented, it's I. Second, there's a failure, though, you can find something situational, find something to blame it on. And you don't have to copy all these examples down. I'm just illustrating that there's a lot of them. The second somebody says, I blame my teacher for not preparing us, or that test was on a Monday, or nobody could pass that test, or it was a bad test. The second you start to consider external situational factors and blame them for your failures, you're illustrating what's called the self-serving bias. So maybe you go to a job interview and you don't get the job and you say to yourself, that interview was bad. The questions they were asking were unfair. You're blaming situational factors. It's what we call the self-serving bias. But had you got that job, you might have said to yourself, I interviewed so well. I did so well. I was so well prepared. I studied that business before going in. I knew what I was doing. We have this tendency to blame the situation when it's a failure, but credit ourselves when it is a success. So we've got 3 remaining boxes. We'll proceed now to the just world hypothesis. This is another attribution error. This is an assumption that people can sometimes make, not all the time, but sometimes, that if something bad has happened to someone, they've probably in some capacity done something to deserve it. So for example, you see somebody homeless or you see somebody on the street and you might think to yourself, well, maybe they're using drugs or maybe they got fired or maybe they've made bad life decisions that have put them into this position to have this bad thing happen to them. And then the inverse, if something really great happens to someone, we have the tendency to say, well, they probably worked hard to deserve it. They got a promotion, they probably, deserved it. They probably did something at work to demonstrate their capacity. It's called the just world hypothesis because that's not in and of itself always true. Kind of similar to fundamental attribution error, you don't necessarily always know the situation. Somebody could have lost their home for reasons really outside of their control for all intents and purposes. Maybe there was a natural disaster or pandemic. There are things that could happen that don't necessarily fall in line with the just world hypothesis, where bad things always happen to people that necessarily deserve them. If you've ever heard the phrase blaming the victim, this is a really great example of the just world hypothesis, sort of this inaccurate assumption. For example, you look at this sign, please do not encourage criminals by leaving valuables in your vehicle. It's basically telling you to lock your car and keep your valuables. But it's also at the same time telling you, if you do happen to get robbed, if somebody does break into your car, it's your fault for putting yourself in that position. So a bad thing happened to somebody who deserved it because you left your valuables in the car, which is really asinine. It's the criminal, it's the person who breaks into your car's fault. It can never be the victim's fault. That's really silly. But that sign is an illustration of the just world hypothesis, where bad things happen to people that must clearly in some capacity deserve them, while good things happen to people that somehow deserve it, sort of in the inverse. It's an attribution error. This sign really is implying something that's really not factual. 2 remaining boxes in this column. The first of which is what we call the false consensus effect. The false consensus effect happens when you think your beliefs are way more popular than they really are. So you start to assume everybody loved this movie, and the next thing you know, you're sitting in class talking about the movie, and you realize, wait, I'm the only person that liked that movie? I'm the only person that's watching that show on Netflix? You make the assumption that your personal beliefs are really popular. And the next thing you know, you find yourself in a situation and you sort of have that realization that, whoa, nobody else agrees with me. So maybe there's a certain political candidate that you support, and you kind of just assume everybody supports that candidate. And then you start talking to people and they're like, wait a minute, am I the only person here that voting for that person? And that's called the false consensus effect, where you make this inaccurate assumption that the beliefs that you have are actually way more popular than they are. And the example there is a little silly. I would say that most often people like dogs and puppies and pets and things like that. But perhaps you are a really big fan of chinchillas or some of the more unusual pets out there or less common pets. And you start to make these comments about how, yeah, everybody loves chinchillas. And then you realize that's actually probably not the case. There are people around you who simply don't. That's called the false consensus effect. Whether it's with movies, whether it's with political candidates, whether it's with pets, anytime you just assume that your beliefs are popular, when that might not necessarily be the case, it's what we call the false consensus effect. And the last one is called the halo effect. This one's really clear illustration of an attribution error where, and this is really something you should consider in a job interview, your first impression of somebody in one aspect of life can sort of overlap into their assessment of other aspects and qualities. So for example, the really classic study, the really classic way this is illustrated is with dress. If you show up to a job interview dressed well, dressed for the part, an individual who dresses in an appropriate professional attire is going to be evaluated highly and more effective than an individual who dresses in something more casual, even if they, from all intents and purposes, answer the questions the same way and present the same qualifications. But because that impression about dress was positive at the beginning with that well put together outfit, that professional outfit, it sort of bled over into other aspects of your evaluation. Because again, the whole point of this concept map and this topic is to try and evaluate how people judge the behavior of others. And if you present yourself as professional, well put together, that can bleed over into other qualities. We call it the halo effect, where people who are dressed well tend to be perceived smarter, funnier, more capable, even if the person is equally as qualified as somebody who showed up to that job interview in more casual clothing. So that's really a key here. When you do have job interviews, whether you have college interviews, whatever it might be, you dress professional. That first impression is really a big deal. You can really present yourself in a manner that starts to overlap and bleed into the other evaluations that individual is making. Because all of a sudden you dress professionally, you dress well, you might be evaluated as being more intelligent than other applicants, which, of course, if you're in the middle of a job interview and a job interview search or a job search, that's a really important thing.